Last week, I asked you to imagine a scenario that maybe you didn't have to use too much imagination to recall this, but a child coming to you and saying, "I'm starving." As you look around and say, "Really? Do you know what it means to starve? Do you see this food that we have here?" Or maybe you've been around a young person waving around their very expensive cell phone as they say, "Isn't there any Wi-Fi signal here? I can't get to my stuff fast enough." We have no problem loudly expressing the need that we have. Do we? It comes pretty natural. But let me ask kind of a follow-up question to that. Are we just as quick to express our gratitude when that need is answered? Ouch, right? But it's true. We are really quick to say, "This is what I need," or maybe even grumble, "Why don't I have this?" And then once that's supplied, are we just as quick to say thank you for that? Or do we just kind of take it for granted? I guess we shouldn't be surprised because it really is innate human nature. I mean, think about it this way. You don't have to teach a child to loudly express when they have a need. Right? That just comes natural, that child is going to loudly express to you that they have a need. But we do have to teach our children to say thank you, to express their gratitude. In fact, we have to coach them a lot. We have to prompt them. Now, what do you say? Or sometimes we even tell them, say thank you. And we have to sometimes, because they're down like this and they're mumbling, we have to say, well, speak up so they can hear you. Or we have to say, well, look up and look them in the eyes. And maybe there's not a lot of sincerity behind it. It's a long process to coach the children to be able to express their gratitude loudly enough for people to hear it and sincerely enough for them to feel like it truly is gratitude. We don't have to do that for expressing our need. That just comes naturally. G.K. Chesterton captured it well when he said this: in life, you can take things one of two ways. You can take them for granted, or you can take them with gratitude. Now, I was thinking about that. What do you think might be the ratio of people who take things with gratitude or people who just simply take things for granted? As you've kind of experienced that in society, what would you think the ratio is? I think, sadly, that the ratio is 1 in 10. I think for every 10 people, there's only one that really quickly and sincerely expresses their gratitude, and the other 9 just sort of take it for granted that they were supposed to get that, or they just keep on grumbling because they can't even see the blessing that they've been given. And the reason why I give you that ratio is because I think it's a ratio that we see right here in the Bible, and it carries through. Luke tells a story in chapter 17 of his gospel that isn't recorded in the other gospels, but it's very informative for us. It says this: "Now on his way to Jerusalem, Jesus traveled along the border between Samaria and Galilee. As he was going into a village, 10 men who had leprosy met him. They stood at a distance and called out in a loud voice, 'Jesus, Master, have pity on us.' When he saw them, he said, 'Go, show yourselves to the priests.' And as they went, they were cleansed." Now, here's 10 guys that have no problem loudly expressing their need for healing of leprosy. They have no problem with that. Now, notice where Jesus is. He's on the border between Samaria and Galilee. That tells me that these guys are traveling. They're not allowed to be in their hometowns. They're not allowed to be inside the villages or in their homes. They're not allowed to go to the temple or into the marketplace. They have to really stay away from society. In fact, they would announce it ahead of time. They would tell people as they were coming close by, they would yell out, "Unclean, unclean." And so maybe they're out here in this borderland because maybe they heard in Samaria there's somebody who has a miracle cure for leprosy, or over here in the outskirts of Galilee is somebody who's maybe been able to do something with leprosy. They've traveled around, but loudly they call out to Jesus their need. We have a need. And they stand at a distance. You see, a person with leprosy, if they were to even poke their head through a friend's window to say hi, that friend and his entire household would have to go through a cleansing process. They would have to have a week that they would leave their home and leave their village. They'd have to live outside the village while the priest watched them and monitored them to see if they exhibited any of the symptoms of leprosy. And then there was a whole ceremonial cleansing process for them to be able to come back into town and come back into their own home. So these lepers are used to just standing way off. And so they stand at a distance and call out in a loud voice, "Jesus, Master." I like that they called him Master. That word expresses authority. Maybe they've heard stories about Jesus. They haven't seen him themselves, but they've heard the stories. They've reached their ears. Hey, this is a man who has opened blind eyes and he's made lame people walk. I heard about him turning water into wine. I've heard these stories. I wonder about leprosy. And so they call out in a loud voice, "Jesus, Master, have pity on us." And you know what? They called out to the right person because Jesus heals them with a word. He just simply says, "Go." He doesn't anoint them with oil. He doesn't lay his hands on them. He just simply says, "Go." And it says that as they went, they were cleansed. Now, cleansed. Leviticus chapter 14 has 32 very detailed verses about the cleansing process. How you go back to the priests and say, "My leprosy has been cleansed," and the priests would inspect, and then there was a whole ritual with the sacrifices that had to be done, and birds and water and all these different things before you could re-engage and re-enter into society. And all 10 of them were cleansed. And yet there's one that stands out. Here's how Luke goes on. One of them, when he saw he was healed, came back praising God in a loud voice. He threw himself at Jesus' feet and thanked him. And he was a Samaritan. And Jesus asked, "Were not all 10 cleansed? Where are the other 9? Was no one found to return and give praise to God except this foreigner?" Then he said to him, "Rise and go. Your faith has made you well." So all 10 of them called out in a loud voice, "We have a need. Nothing else has worked. We have no problem loudly expressing to you our need." And yet there's only one. And notice he didn't stay at a distance this time. One of them came back praising God in a loud voice, threw himself at Jesus' feet and thanked him. Just one was grateful. Now, there's a word here that both Luke and Jesus use. It's the same word in both English and in Greek. Luke says this, after Jesus says, "Go show yourself to the priests," Luke writes this, "And as they went, they were cleansed." Jesus says the same thing in verse 17. He asks, "Were not all 10 cleansed?" Now again, that cleansing is on the outside. There is a ceremonial cleansing that has taken place. The leprosy is no longer visible. It's no longer active on their skin. And so they are allowed to re-enter society. But there's this one that receives something different. When I was reading this story this last week, it reminded me of a story from my childhood. My grandfather owned a tool and die shop in the suburbs of Detroit, and they supplied to auto manufacturers and other shops. And it was during times when the economy was a little rough. But as the year came to a close, my grandfather's shop had done well that year. At least they had finished in the black. Now, they weren't flush with money, but they had finished in the black. And my grandpa wanted to express his gratitude to his employees. He had dozens of employees. They ran 3 shifts. So they had people there around the clock that were working and were dedicated to the process. And he wanted to express his gratitude. And so he wrote out Christmas bonus checks for every single one of his employees. And he handed them out. At the end of the day, as he was leaving and heading to his car, there was one employee that was waiting for him. And he said, "Sir, very grateful for this Christmas bonus. My family, this is really going to help us this year. This is going to help. We're going to have a very Merry Christmas because of your blessing, and I'm grateful. Thank you very much for that." Just one. Only one out of the dozens and dozens of employees. All of them received a Christmas bonus in the same amount. Just one came back to express his gratitude. Fast forward a year later, it's the end of the year. The company has finished in the black again. My grandpa wants to express his gratitude, and he sits down to write out Christmas bonus checks. And he wrote just one check. And I bet you can guess who received that one check. The one who expressed his gratitude. Very similar to this man here. All 10 of them were cleansed, we're told twice. But notice what Jesus said here in this last verse. Jesus said to him, "Rise and go, your faith has made you well." Now Jesus uses a different word here. In the Greek, this word is sozo. Sozo. This is not an outward cleansing. This is an inward cleansing. This isn't just ceremonial so that you can re-enter society and you can go back to the temple and now some of the reproach has been removed against you because you weren't able to be a part of all of those things. This is deeper than that. All 10 of them were cleansed on the outside, but just one, because of his gratitude, because of his loud praising and thankfulness to Jesus, earned him something far deeper. Rise and go, your faith has made you well. The Message paraphrase translates this, I think, the closest of all, where Eugene Peterson writes, "Rise and go, your faith has saved you." Here's why I think that is the most accurate translation. Let me show you some of the other places that this word sozo is used. Let me show you, first of all, what Jesus said about it. In John's Gospel, John chapter 3, I think most people are familiar with John chapter 3, verse 16. God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son. But check out the very next verse. Jesus says this, "For God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but to save," that's that same word, sozo, "to save the world through him." See, Jesus wanted to do more than just cleanse on the outside. He said, what I'm doing on the outside is just to show you so you can see it and it can build your faith to believe for what I can do on the inside. I don't want to just allow you to come back to the temple to worship. I want you to be able to stand in God's temple in eternity forever and ever and worship. And so what I do on the outside is intended to build your faith. And with gratitude, you can build that faith that will bring salvation. Jesus said it again in John chapter 10. "I am the gate. Whoever enters through me will be saved." Sozo. Peter uses the same word on the day of Pentecost when in his sermon, he says, "And everyone," not most people, but everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. Now, I like that phrase there, everyone who calls on the name of the Lord, right? They called in a loud voice, "Jesus, Master, have pity on us," all 10 of them, and received the outward cleansing. But just one called on Jesus in a praising voice that was also a loud voice and came close to Jesus, threw himself at his feet, and thanked him. And he is the one who was saved. There is something about that confession from our mouth that expresses the gratitude and the faith in our hearts. Let me show you one other verse that Paul says this in Romans chapter 10. If you declare with your mouth, that's what that one Samaritan did, Jesus is Lord, your master, and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. Sozo. Once again, not just a physical cleansing, but the inward security that your sins have been forgiven. And that's what holds you secure forever. Not just allows you to re-enter society for the rest of your natural life, but saves you forever. Now, friends, like I said, the ratio that we see here, the 1 out of 10, is probably pretty close to what we see in society today. But sadly, one of the things that Paul writes to us is that as the end times approach, that ratio is going to get even smaller. Listen to what he says to his friend Timothy. He says, "But mark this, there will be terrible times in the last days. People will be lovers of themselves, lovers of money, boastful, proud, abusive, disobedient to their parents, ungrateful. Think about that. This attitude of ingratitude fits right in here with all of this ugly stuff of being lovers of themselves, lovers of money, boastful, proud, abusive, disobedient to their parents, ungrateful. And he says, mark this, in the last times, expect to see this growing more and more. Expect that ratio to become bigger and bigger for people who just loudly express their need. They grumble, they complain. And then what happens when they get what they want? Are they grateful for it? Remember last week we saw that E.M. Bounds told us that gratitude and murmuring never abide in the same heart at the same time. It's true. And Paul says, expect here in these last days that that's going to become even more predominant. But we also talked about in the book of Philippians, this church that Paul founded in the city of Philippi, how the letter is just bubbling up with gratitude. We talked about, he only gets 3 verses in and he says, I am so grateful for you, friends. Every time I think about you, I start praising God, much like this leper did. When I think about what God has done in your lives, not the outward cleansing, but the inward change, he says, it just causes me to be grateful. And that idea of gratitude just shows up throughout this whole letter. Well, look at one of the things that he ties together. Think about this word sozo, this salvation, where Jesus said, rise and go, your faith has saved you. Your gratitude has led to this internal security. Listen to how Paul ties these together in Philippians chapter 3. Whatever happens, my dear brothers and sisters, rejoice in the Lord. Be grateful for what God has given you. I never get tired of telling you these things, and I do it to safeguard your faith. Notice that connection of being grateful and our faith safeguarding our souls. Because listen to this, how this ugly list goes on in 2 Timothy. I'll pick up with ungrateful. He goes on to say unholy, without love, unforgiving, slanderous, without self-control, brutal, not lovers of the good, treacherous, rash, conceited, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God. Lovers of give me what I need rather than God, I just want you. But listen to this last phrase, having a form of godliness, but denying its power. Having a form of godliness. Doesn't that sound like the 9 that didn't return to Jesus? They now had the outward form that allowed them to go into the temple, allowed them to re-engage in society. But Paul says, but denying its power. There was only one that said, the Jesus Master that we called out to has the power not only to cleanse my leprosy on the outside, but to cleanse the leprous spots on my soul, to save me forever. Now, back in this book of Philippians, 2 weeks ago, we saw how Paul said, we looked at this verse in chapter 2, verse 14, do everything without complaining or arguing. And Paul said that when we live that way, it makes us stand out. Well, let me show you how it makes us stand out. He goes on, do everything without complaining or arguing so that. So what happens when we are not complainers, when we are grateful people instead? He says, so that you may become blameless and pure, children of God without fault in a crooked and depraved generation in which you shine like stars in the universe as you hold out the word of life. Now, anthropologists tell us in the natural sense, the replacement birth rate, in other words, to keep a society's population from declining, the replacement birth rate is 2.1. Okay, kind of makes sense, right? If there's 2 adults and they produce 2 kids, they've reproduced themselves. The 0.1 is to allow for infant mortality. Sadly, in most of the developed nations around the world, the birth rate has fallen below replacement rate. In other words, the societies are going to begin to decline in population. Well, what about the replacement rate for gratitude? That seems like an uphill battle, doesn't it? Here's only 1 out of 10 lepers that return. So that was a replacement rate of 0.1. That's pretty low. And yet, here's what Paul says. When you do everything without complaining and grumbling, but you're doing things with gratitude, he says, you shine brightly. The attitude of gratitude makes you stand out. Let me show you why this is so important. Look at the definition for the word influence. It means what you probably think that it means. It's that you are able to compel somebody, you are able to nudge somebody to act a certain way, to live a certain way. But look as well in number 2 there. This is the origin of the word influence. It's this idea that the stars exhibit some sort of pulling force that affect men's lives. That's really what Paul's saying here. He says, you do everything without complaining or arguing. You be the 1 in 10, and then what happens? He says, you shine like a star in the universe as you hold out the word of life. You can be an influencer even if you're the 1 in 10. In fact, friends, I would sum it up by saying this. Your consistent gratitude is influencing the people around you. It's giving them a star to chart their course, probably more consistently than anything else you can do. When you are the one that is just as quick to express your gratitude as you are your need, when you are sincere, when you are saying, I'm not just looking for the outward, I'm not just like these people in 2 Timothy, just looking for a lover of self. What is something pleasurable for me? I don't want to just have an outward form of godliness, but I want to recognize the power behind all of these things that I've received, and I want to acknowledge God as the provider of those things. I want to be quick to be a person of gratitude, not complaining, not grumbling, not murmuring, but being grateful and loudly expressing my gratitude. Paul says you're a person of influence. Jesus says that gratitude builds your faith that makes a difference on the inside, and then it bubbles up on the outside, and you shine like a star, and you influence people's lives. So friends, listen, don't get caught up and say, well, hey, 1 out of 10, what difference is it going to make in my life? 1 star. Shine brightly. Be the 1 in 10. Shine brightly. Loudly give your praise to God. Express your gratitude consistently and sincerely and loudly for all to hear. And you are going to make a difference. You are going to shine brightly. And God will be glorified in that. As always, friends, I love to be able to interact with you. If you've got questions, comments, prayer requests, you can leave them as a comment below or reach out to me. There's a lot of other ways that you can get in contact with me. I'd be more than happy to talk with you more. God bless you, friends. Shine brightly this week as you are a grateful person. I love you.